Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is going to be Unit 9, Civil Rights. We're in Lesson 1, and this is Part 2. And so please take out your journals, pick up right where we left off last time. We were discussing the background to the modern civil rights movement that's going to get kickstarted in the 1950s. And remember, we had discussed in the last lecture the Jim Crow laws, the laws of racial segregation that were actual laws in the South that kept whites and blacks separated. That often meant that African Americans would get the poorer things, the less nice things. When it came to water fountains, restrooms, restaurants, pretty much every accommodation, including schools. And so we're going to start today's lecture discussing the politics of civil rights. Now, remember that when the Republican Party first began, it was in the Civil War. The first Republican president was Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln, fighting for the Union, the North, that Civil War became the cause of freeing the slaves. And Lincoln did that. At the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment does get ratified, which ended slavery in America. There were some terrible loopholes to it, but slavery was outlawed with the 13th Amendment. And remember, the 14th Amendment is going to grant those former slaves citizenship to be treated equally under the law. The 15th Amendment will grant African Americans, especially only men, the right to vote. So those were the civil rights, the Reconstruction Amendments. Now, because Lincoln was a Republican, most African Americans that were able to participate in politics, to vote and hold office during Reconstruction, this is like the 1870s, early 1870s, they were Republicans, like almost 100%. African Americans were solidly part of the Republican Party because that was the party of Abraham Lincoln. And then we get to, and the Democratic Party was the party that actually had like kind of the Ku Klux Klan in the South as their like military branch. And so the Democrats were definitely not the party for blacks back in the late 1800s. Now that is going to begin to change when you get to the 1930s because of the Great Depression, because of Democratic President FDR, remember he's in a wheelchair, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he had polio. He has all these programs designed to help get America out of the Great Depression called the New Deal. Remember, they sound like alphabet soup, the CCC, the WPA, the PWA, all those programs, many of them are going to be very important in helping those Americans that were most hit by the Depression, including African Americans. Not to mention that Franklin Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, she's going to be very instrumental in kind of beginning the civil rights movement, always pressuring her president husband, FDR, to do more to assist minorities, especially women and especially blacks. And so for those reasons that the New Deal was kind of looking out for everybody, that here this government under this Democratic president was trying to help, everybody, even the poorest Americans, even Americans of different colors. You start to see some African Americans begin to switch parties and begin to vote for the Democratic Party because of the New Deal. And then you're going to have another Democratic president, the one who followed FDR. That's Harry Truman. He was the guy with the big glasses who, remember, had to end World War II. He decided to make the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan to end the war, force Japan to surrender quickly. Truman in 1948 will desegregate the military. He had been a soldier himself fighting in the Great War, with the tear gas and the trenches and everything. And as a soldier himself, he thought it was very dishonorable the way that America was treating its black soldiers and sailors, men like Doris Miller and Vernon Baker, men like the Tuskegee Airmen, those black pilots. They had fought and served, and many of them made the ultimate sacrifice, such as our hometown hero with Pearl Harbor, Doris Miller. He died 2 years to the day after his heroics on December 7th, 1941. So for their sacrifices, Truman desegregates the military, and all future American wars will feature black and white soldiers fighting side by side because of that, such as like the first one being the Korean War. And because Truman, a Democrat, desegregated the military, a first major step toward desegregating or ending segregation, bringing whites and blacks back together with the military, that's going to also cause many African Americans to begin to switch parties to instead, be Democrats now. And you're going to see this trend continue. Eisenhower was not a strong proponent of civil rights. He will enforce the Brown v. Board decision we're going to talk about with the Little Rock Nine. And there will be a civil rights law passed in 1957 that Eisenhower signs, but all it did was really put together a commission on maybe ending discrimination. It didn't do a whole lot. So Eisenhower isn't really a strong leader when it came to civil rights. He was the Republican president, remember, from 1952 to 1961. And he had been our big, hero of D-Day in World War II, our general. But after Eisenhower, you get this young, dynamic president named John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960. And when he takes office in 1961, he actually puts civil rights more at the forefront of his agenda. He's kind of forced to in many ways, but he begins to put civil rights as a priority, and he's a Democrat. And then after, John F. Kennedy gets assassinated in Dallas, after his assassination on November 22nd, 1963, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, or LBJ, he's from Texas, he's a Southern Democrat. Many people did not see him as like a leader of civil rights, being a Southern Democrat, but he will actually become like the civil rights president. You'll get landmark, like really important civil rights laws, such as the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All of those, plus his Great Society programs, will definitely benefit African Americans in major ways. And so for those reasons, with JFK and LBJ putting civil rights so much at the forefront, you will see by the 1960s, 1970s, most African Americans will have switched parties and become Democrats. And now if you look today, most African Americans vote for the Democratic Party because it does seem to put civil rights more at the the base of its core values. So that's what we're talking about with the switching of the parties. All right, so there are some important civil rights organizations that you guys need to be aware of. Remember, in review, 1909, you had the formation of the NAACP, it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And it was founded way back in 1909 by a group of African-American leaders, the Talented 10th, if you want to call them that. W.E.B. Du Bois sure did. And they met at the Niagara Convention at Niagara Falls and are basically going to create this organization. It is, remember W.E.B. Du Bois, this is one of his big organizations, to basically advance African-American civil rights through the law, through the courts. When they need legal action, litigation, when they need to lawyer up and go to court to fight unfair, unjust segregation laws, the NAACP will be there, and it is still around to this day. Now, a new organization that we're going to introduce today is CORE. This is the Congress on Racial Equality, and it's actually a Northern civil rights group made up of many Blacks, but also some whites. So this is a mixed race group of civil rights leaders. And it was founded in part by James Farmer Jr. James Farmer Jr. was actually from Texas and then moved up north when he founded this organization. And there's a wonderful movie actually about kind of his early life when he was just starting college. He was very precocious, starting college at like 14. But that was kind of common back in the day. But in the 1930s, he was attending Marshall College, a Black college in Texas. Remember, schools were all segregated back in the 30s, especially in the South. And so James Farmer Jr., and the movie's called The Great Debaters, by the way. It stars Denzel Washington. It's a really wonderful movie if you get a chance to check it out. But anyway, James Farmer Jr. is going to found this group, CORE. Black and white Northern civil rights activists are going to be organizing voter registration drives, trying to go down into the South and get Blacks registered to vote, because being able to vote is your way to affect change and make things different, make things better, have a voice. The other thing that CORE is really famous for is going to be the Freedom Rides, which really began in the 1960s. And a Freedom Ride was where you would have a bus, like a Greyhound bus, go from a northern city with a mixed race audience on board. So there would be Black and white bus riders riding this Greyhound, and they would go from a northern city down into the South, a route through the South into like a big southern cities such as Montgomery or, Atlanta. Okay, and on this way, they'd have to make stops, as buses do, to get food and snacks, to use the bathroom. And everywhere they would stop, they would, be kind of demonstrating and showcasing like, hey, look at us. We're blacks and whites. We're getting along. Like, can't we all just get along? It's a demonstration. It's a form of peaceful protest, a freedom ride. Now, oftentimes, however, these freedom rides were met with extreme violence, and the police would even tip off the local Ku Klux Klan, and they would be there to meet these freedom ride buses and assault them. Several of them were even bombed. And so there were some freedom riders who were actually killed during these peaceful bus rides. So that is CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. All right, so the main thing we're talking about today is going to be the efforts to get schools and other things desegregated in the South, the road to desegregation. Remember the NAACP, they are about lawyering up, there we go, to fight segregation policies. This is, remember, W.E.B. Du Bois's civil rights group from way back when, that provides the lawyers to champion civil rights. And one of the top lawyers for the NAACP that you really need to remember is Thurgood Marshall. There's a picture of him right there. Thurgood Marshall had been the main lawyer in the Sweatt versus Painter case. And again, in 1954, he'll be the main lawyer in the very famous, very important Brown versus Board of Education case that's going to desegregate all of America's schools. And then later on in the 1960s, Thurgood Marshall will actually be appointed as the first African-American Supreme Court Justice by Lyndon Johnson. And so he is a very important African-American leader for civil rights, lawyer, and a very important Supreme Court Justice in our government. So that's Thurgood Marshall. And an easy way I have of remembering him is that this guy is thoroughly good. So remember Thurgood Marshall. Okay, so the first case we're going to talk about is Sweatt v. Painter, okay? Now, Heman Sweatt was a veteran, and he was a college graduate who wanted to go back and get another degree at the University of Texas. He wants to get his higher education at a great college. I mean, UT, hook 'em horns. It is like probably, just my opinion, it's one of the best colleges in the nation. It has top, engineering, science degrees, mathematics, history. It's a really, really good college, but it was segregated at this time. And so he is going to try to get into the UT Law School. He's trying to become a lawyer, and he is denied his admission because it's segregated. And so he sues the college. Theodosius Painter was the president of the University of Texas. So that's where you get the case Sweatt v. Painter. Heman Sweatt, this African-American, veteran and graduate who wants to go to law school there. He applies, he gets rejected, he sues the college. Theodosius Painter is the president of the university, so that's the case. The NAACP is going to get Thurgood Marshall and Charles Houston to basically assist Heman Sweatt, this African-American student who's trying to get in. And during the case, the Texas court is basically going to say, let's put a timeout on this. And what they do is they give the state of Texas enough time to create an alternate law school, because the argument that Marshall and Houston, the lawyers for the NAACP, used to support Sweatt's case was that, hey, look, Heman Sweatt wants to go to law school. He's an African-American. There is no law school that is desegregated in Texas. They are all segregated. So he has no alternative. So this is not fair and equal under the doctrine of separate but equal under the Plessy versus Ferguson case. He has no other option. So he must be allowed to attend UT. So that's where the Texas court says, oh, okay, timeout. So they do this timeout. And in the 6 months or so that they do the timeout, they allow the state of Texas to quickly build together this ramshod new law school down in Houston. Well, the very quickly constructed new law school down in Houston is not going to be equal to the law school at the University of Texas in Austin. Okay. And so again, this case goes up to the Supreme Court, and Sweatt's lawyers, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Houston, they argue, hey, look, this ain't separate but equal. Okay, this might be separate, but it sure ain't equal. And they proved through systematically showing what the Houston Law School, they compare it to the UT Law School. They compare like the library at the UT Law School has thousands of legal textbooks. The new law school for Black law students in Houston had like one shelf of textbooks. The law school at UT had like a mock court and moot trials and all this other, fancy stuff, and all these buildings and professors that were tenured who had been there forever and super experienced. The Houston Law School had like 2 professors and didn't have any of that, stuff. So they showed without a shadow of a doubt that these 2 law schools were not equal, not even close, okay? And they won their case, which was a really big deal and kind of opening up the door for desegregating all schools. Now, we're not there yet, but this is, again, like, just getting that crack in the door. They're opening it up. And so this case is going to kind of lay the foundation for the Brown versus Board decision, because they win this. Hemon Sweatt is allowed to go to the UT Law School, and it's going to begin to open up some higher education, some colleges for desegregation. All right, then we get to the big one, okay? So this is again going to be NAACP key lawyer, future first African-American Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who is litigating this case, okay? And this is in 1954. And it centers around a lawsuit by many families, but the first one, because they go alphabetically, was the family of little Linda Brown. Her dad, Oliver Brown, was the one to file the suit with many other parents at this Topeka, Kansas school district. Now in Topeka, it's a state that's actually in the middle of the country, and so it doesn't have the by law Jim Crow segregation that like these southern states that are in purple did. Okay, if you look on this map, see the purple states, they required segregated schools. You weren't allowed to have blacks and whites mix at all. If it's a state that was in green, they did not have segregated schools. And if it was a state in orange, like Kansas, you could see in the middle, here's Kansas, then it was a state that allowed districts to choose for themselves whether or not they would segregate. And in Topeka, they did. And so little Linda Brown is an elementary school student. She's just like 7 years old. She's very young. And she has to walk, or take the bus, like all the way across town, across the railroad tracks and everything else to go to the Black elementary school. When there's actually a white elementary school, like in her neighborhood, and she's growing up in an integrated neighborhood where you have blacks and whites, mixed together in the same neighborhood. So like she can't go to the same school as her friends because she's Black. And so Oliver Brown, her dad, and many other Black parents in Topeka, they file suit for the school district. And this is the case that's going to go before the Supreme Court on whether or not segregation in schools should be allowed to continue. Because really this is an issue about Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. Is separate but equal still okay? Is that something that was right? So that's the question before the court. And in the trial, Thurgood Marshall, the lawyer, he really, he tries different tactics. He tried to do what he did in Sweatt v. Painter, which was to illustrate the inequity, to show that Black schools were almost always inferior to the white schools, that they had, less resources, less money for textbooks, less money for good qualified teachers, less money for the facility itself. Oftentimes these Black schools did not have running water. They did not have electricity. So he tried to show, like he did in Sweatt v. Painter, but then the lawyers on the other side, they came back and showed like a few examples of schools that didn't match up with. And so then he tries another tactic. And this is going to be very successful. It was called the doll test. And it showed racial stigmas in children at an early age and the damaging effects that racial segregation played on the development of these children as they became adults. So the doll test, and I'll show you the clip from the movie here about it, but basically the doll test would have a child brought forward as a witness during the Supreme Court trial. And the child would be, given these different dolls in front of them. And then the lawyer would ask, okay, so, and the dolls, there was a white doll, a black doll. And then the lawyer would ask, okay, which is the doll you would rather play with? And almost all the kids, they would pick the white doll. Which is the doll that is prettier? Okay, and they would most of them pick the white doll. Which is the doll that is more likely to get in trouble? And they would pick the black doll. And what this does, it's heartbreaking, but it shows that these kids, by being segregated, were being taught to believe, the black children were being taught to believe, because they were segregated, that they were less somehow than their white counterparts. And that's heartbreaking. And so in the Supreme Court case, Thurgood Marshall, this lawyer for the NAACP, he does this doll test to show the damaging long-term effects that segregation plays. And the fact that it shouldn't matter, like, if this textbook isn't as great in this black school as this textbook in this white school, that's not the big picture here. The big picture that Thurgood Marshall is demonstrating through the doll test is that segregation is wrong at a fundamental level because it is inherently unequal. Just the very nature of having whites and blacks separated says that they're not equal. And so that is how he wins this case, basically. And when the Supreme Court was deliberating, when the Supreme Court was deciding, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, his name was Earl Warren. There's 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Earl Warren, by the way, had been the governor of California. He's actually the governor of California, I think, back when Japanese internment had happened. So that wasn't great. But he's also the governor of California, I believe, when they did the Mendez versus Westminster case. So he'd had kind of a history of desegregation. And so as Chief Justice, Earl Warren got the rest of his other 8 Supreme Court justices in line, and he told them, look, we have to have a unanimous decision here. We have to be clear, not even one of us can disagree. We all have to be for desegregating the America's schools, okay? And so the Supreme Court is unanimously going to decide. All 9 justices of the Supreme Court will vote to desegregate schools. And what this case did, Brown versus Board, it's going to desegregate schools legally all around the country. No longer is segregation in schools going to be allowed. And that overturns, that gets rid of the old case, that terrible case we were just reviewing, Plessy versus Ferguson. From 1896, separate but equal shall be the law of the land. That allowed segregation all around the country. Now that is being thrown out by Brown versus Board. That's why this is such an important case. It's going to end school segregation everywhere, legally, okay? So please keep that word in mind, legally. Because as you guys are probably aware, just because the law changes doesn't mean that people's habits are immediately going to follow, okay? Just because the Supreme Court said that segregation in schools across America was now illegal, they said no more school segregation, doesn't mean that all schools are suddenly going to follow this, are suddenly going to comply. And in fact, the Brown versus Board decision is going to be met with massive resistance from the South, from those states you can see on the map that are in purple, like our state of Texas. They're going to resist. Many white legislatures will rail and say that their schools aren't going to do this. Many white schools and school boards are going to refuse to follow this new law. And many whites in the South will find ways to attack African Americans, and even African American children will be targeted in their racism and their fierce, angry reaction to this Supreme Court justice. To the Supreme Court case. Oops. Show that later. Okay. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about today, I know that this lecture is going a little bit long, but I wanted to make sure we covered this in this lecture today. Speaking of the massive resistance following the Brown versus Board decision. So that was in 1954 that the Supreme Court desegregated all of America's schools. There's going to be a huge white backlash of many white supremacists and racists in the South that will refuse to follow this. And racial tensions are going to be at a peak. They're going to be really high in the South. And that's when you have this young kid, he's just 14 years old, named Emmett Till, come down to visit some of his family that was in Mississippi. He was from the North. He was from like the Chicago area. So he comes for the summer in 1955 to stay with his cousins. And during his summer in Mississippi, you know, this kid, he's from the North where things were kind of integrated, blacks and whites mixed together. He went to an integrated school. He even bragged to some of his Southern cousins that he had like a white girlfriend and stuff. And he is totally in culture shock by how blacks are treated in the South. He's not used to this racial oppression, these Jim Crow segregation laws. And so him and some of his friends and cousins, they were going to a grocery shop, a little corner store here in Mississippi. And they kind of were talking to the lady at the counter who owns the store for her husband. Her husband was not there at the store at that moment. But she was this young white woman, and Emmett Till, he was dared by some of his friends maybe to, you know, say something to her because they just couldn't believe that he had like a white girlfriend and stuff. And so on his way out, he kind of said like, bye baby, you know, like that kind of thing or something cutesy. You know, he's just a little kid. He's like, think of like a little 8th grader, a little freshman. Okay. Now, later that day, this woman, she told her husband that Emmett Till had actually gone around the counter and touched her, that he had like put his arm around her and had, you know, harassed her. And he had, you know, sexually harassed her in some way. So she made up this whole thing about what this little kid had done. And so the husband that night, along with his brother, you know, the brother-in-law, those two white men, they show up at the cousin's house where Emmett Till was staying, and they bang on the door at like 1 a.m. in the morning, and they demand to see Emmett Till. And basically they have guns and stuff. And so they kidnap this boy. They take him from his bed at night and they throw him in the back of the pickup. They tie him up and they take him out to this abandoned barn where they torture him. They literally cut off pieces of his body. They gouge out his eyes. They torture and mutilate this poor little boy, and then they murder him. They shoot him. And then they throw his corpse in the local river. They absolutely like murder this kid. And his body isn't found until several days later, bloated and decomposed, as you can see in this picture here. So his mom was still up in Chicago when all of this happened. And she finds out about what they did to her little boy. She is going to obviously be beyond consolation, but she does something really smart here. She basically has an open casket funeral, and she invites all of the major Black reporters and newspapers and news organizations to come and attend this funeral, you know, up in Chicago, for her little baby boy that was murdered, that was butchered down in the South by these white racists. And so the pictures of Emmett Till's body, of a 14-year-old kid's body that was murdered because nothing, just because of his race. He didn't do anything to deserve this. They go national and they go international, in fact. The murder of Emmett Till, the newspaper pictures of his body and everything, they will be seen by people in like the Soviet Union, over in Russia. And it's going to make America look really bad. It should make America look bad. You know, we're fighting the Cold War, and this is going to make America look like totally asinine, a monster, that we're fighting for peace and freedom and democracy. But look what we're doing back in our own backyard at home to our own people. And so this will definitely cause a lot of national politicians to take notice. And this was, again, right in the immediate reaction after the Brown v. Board decision and massive resistance. It's going to cause, you know, having having this kind of reporting in the news is going to cause many whites around the country to finally start to really examine civil rights for the first time. You know, many white people, if they didn't directly interact with African Americans, they didn't really think about civil rights. They didn't really see this as their problem. This is going to force them to confront this issue and to take a side. And so that's going to be a very important role that the media will play, like not just, you know, radio and newspapers, but also especially television going into the 50s and then especially into the 1960s. TV is incredibly powerful, incredibly important. It's going to be a tool for the civil rights movement to garner more people onto their side. Another tool of the civil rights movement that's going to be really powerful, really important, is going to be the music. And there are songs about the murder of Emmett Till, but there are so many great civil rights songs that I'm going to play a few of them here for you guys at the end of our lecture. But the music of the era, singers and songwriters, the civil rights music, the songs are going to be very important. And gospel music from Black churches also, the songs of like ancestrally slave people. This became the songs that the slaves sang in the fields. This became the gospel music that was sung in churches. It's the songs of sorrow, but also of hope. These will become the songs of civil rights. So music plays a very important role in this as well. All right, we are going to stop there. I know this was long, but I appreciate you guys' attention. So this is the end of part 2. We will finish up lesson 1 next time in part 3. Thank you guys. And part 3, by the way, is going to be the Montgomery bus boycotts and the Little Rock 9. Okay. Montgomery bus boycott, where we talk about Rosa Parks